Now, Donald Trump, as usual, with some angry tweets and mean tweets, and a lot of people couldn't figure out what the hell he's talking about, but I did, and I hope you're prepared to be shocked. I think that he might be right about some of it. Whoa, okay, so let's explain. So here's his tweets. He says, uranium deal to Russia with Clinton help and Obama administration knowledge is the biggest story that fake media doesn't want to follow. He then says, quote, Russia sent millions to Clinton Foundation. And the third one is, workers of firm involved with the discredited and fake dossier take the fifth. Who paid for it? Russia, the FBI, or Dems, or all? So this is as usual sent at 4 in the morning. Does the guy ever sleep? I don't know, man. I'm worried about this guy. Of course, I'm worried about him in 1,000 different ways. Anyway, so people have no idea what he's, uranium, Russia, the FBI and the Democrats and the Russians working together in a collusion? What in the world are you talking about? So the reality is the Hill actually had an excellent report, and at least the first 2 tweets of his are actually fairly accurate. So let me break it down for you. They explain in the Hill, before the Obama administration approved a controversial deal in 2010, giving Moscow control of a large swath of American uranium, the FBI had gathered substantial evidence that Russian nuclear industry officials were engaged in bribery, kickbacks, extortion, and money laundering designed to grow Vladimir Putin's atomic energy business inside the United States, according to government documents and interviews. Now, before I give you more of this, I want to run one more video for you of Trump. Again, he's not great at the English language, so as he's lashing out and attacking the Obama administration in such a convoluted way, he didn't make clear what the point of that was, which is this story, which is a really interesting story. So let me show you what Trump is saying and then explain what parts are actually true. Here, watch.
Uranium is a big subject. If the mainstream media would cover the uranium scandal and that Russia has 20% of our uranium, for whatever reason, and a lot of people understand what those reasons may be, I think that's your Russia story. That's your real Russia story, not a story where they talk about collusion and there was none. It was a hoax. Your real Russia story is uranium and how they got all of that uranium, a vast percentage of what we have. That is, to me, one of the big stories of the decade, not just now, of the decade. The problem is that the mainstream media does not want to cover that story because that affects people that they protect. So they don't like covering that story. But the big story is uranium and how Russia got 20% of our uranium. And frankly, it's a disgrace. It's a disgrace. And it's a disgrace that the fake news won't cover it. It's so sad.
Okay, so it is true about the 20%, as I'm going to show you from the story in the Hill. Oh, right. It's a story in the Hill, which is a mainstream news publication. So they did cover it. In fact, they're the ones who exposed it. And the New York Times had talked about it during the campaign. So what do you mean they don't cover it? The only reason you know about it is because they just covered it. So let me explain what that is, and I'll cover it for you. So they have more details on how the Russians got this and how portions of it were illegal. They also obtained an eyewitness account backed by documents indicating Russian nuclear officials had routed millions of dollars to the US designed to benefit former President Bill Clinton's charitable foundation during the time of Secretary of State Hillary Clinton served on a government body that provided a favorable decision to Moscow, sources told The Hill. These are sources inside the FBI. So of course Trump has some of this story wrong. If the FBI collaborated with the Russians and the Democrats, why are they telling you now about the Russians and the Democrats? So that part also makes no sense. But again, focus on the substance of the story because it is an important one and it is deeply concerning. The racketeering scheme was conducted with the consent of higher level officials in Russia who shared the proceeds from the kickbacks, one agent declared in an affidavit years later. So, by the way, a couple of things here. One is how this uranium got sold off and who got paid and kickbacks, etc. The other is why it was not prominently talked about while things were being approved. So we'll get to that as well. So more from the Hill. The first decision occurred, they're talking about two different decisions here that the Obama administration made. First decision occurred in October of 2010 when the State Department and the government agencies on the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States unanimously approved the partial sale of Canadian mining company Uranium One to the Russian nuclear giant Rosatom, giving Moscow control of more than 20% of America's uranium supply. So that's the 20% Trump's talking about, and that is true. They did do that, that's an absolute fact. Okay, now, it could have been that they did that and it was perfectly legitimate and there was no bribes or kickbacks or anything along those lines or nothing untoward, but as the Hill is reporting, that doesn't seem to be the case. It seems like they might have gotten that through a lot of different methods and some of which were not legal. So here's the second action the Obama administration took. In 2011, the administration gave approval for Rosatom's Tenex subsidiary to sell commercial uranium to US nuclear power plants in a partnership with the United States Enrichment Corporation. So look, some of this is benign, them selling them uranium to us, I don't think is a huge deal. I'm open to being proven otherwise on that, but I don't think that's a big deal. But as the Hill explains, some of the deals, including the trucking of the uranium, could have been a national security issue, okay? Now, and the fact that they have 20% of our uranium so that they could make, they could utilize that for a number of weapons. It's not like they don't have uranium from anywhere else, but again, it is clearly a potential national security issue, okay? And an anonymous source tells the Hill, the Russians were compromising American contractors in the nuclear industry with kickbacks and extortion threats, all of which raised legitimate national security concerns, and none of that evidence got aired before the Obama administration made those decisions. Some details on the kickbacks. The first kickback payment recorded by the FBI through its informant was dated November 27th of 2009, the records show. That's important because we know that they're doing kickbacks in 2009, but we approve those decisions in 2010 and 2011 afterwards. Okay, in evidentiary affidavits signed in 2014 and 2015, an Energy Department agent assigned to assist the FBI in cases testified that Mikorin, which is the main Russian involved here in this scheme, who was later arrested, supervised a quote racketeering scheme that involved extortion, bribery, money laundering, and kickbacks that were both directed by and provided benefit to more senior officials back in Russia. So there's serious wrongdoing going on here as well. And the Hill also reminds you, that's when conservative author Peter Schweizer in the New York Times documented how Bill Clinton collected hundreds of thousands of dollars in Russian speaking fees, and his charitable foundation collected millions in donations from parties interested in the deal while Hillary Clinton presided on the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States. At a bare minimum, that is the appearance of corruption. I mean, don't take millions of dollars to your foundation while Hillary Clinton is a huge part of the decision on whether we sell off 20% of our uranium to the Russians. That's a terrible idea. But the only thing that's worse than that is taking hundreds of thousands of dollars and putting it in your own pocket, not to a charitable foundation, but in your own pocket, Bill Clinton, while Hillary Clinton is helping to make that decision. Even if it's not corruption, and boy, it certainly looks like it. Even if it's not, it certainly has the appearance of corruption. It makes people go, I wonder if they did something wrong. Especially knowing that Hillary Clinton knew from the day that Obama got elected that she was gonna run again. If you think you're gonna run for president again, why would you do that? Because they can't help themselves. The money, the money, the money. Okay, so Trump unfortunately is right that that is a deeply concerning issue. Now, that doesn't mean that his third tweet was right about how the FBI and the Democrats and Russia are somehow in cahoots over the dossier. Now, what the hell is the dossier? That's the dossier that the Russians apparently or allegedly prepared with compromising information about Donald Trump. And some of the parts of that dossier have already been proven correct. Others we don't know about. And so he takes the Uranium One story, which is true, and then says, and hence the dossier must not be true. No, that's not a hence at all. And And there's a couple of Fusion GPS officials who were instrumental in ordering the production of that dossier who decided not to testify. Now that's curious in front of the House, in a private meeting in the House. That's interesting, and I think that's noteworthy, and we should look into that more. But that doesn't mean it has anything to do with the Uranium One deal. It doesn't mean it has anything to do with the Democrats. And remember, it's people in the FBI that are exposing all this either way. Now I'm going to suggest something to you that is both obvious to anyone else, but apparently not obvious to Donald Trump or the Democrats, or even most of cable news. Maybe the Russians wanted to work with the Clintons in case they won, but also wanted to have compromising materials and work with Trump in case he won. To which the rest of us go, of course they did. And by the way, have you noticed that Donald Trump has not authorized the sanctions on Russia? Now wait a minute, the House and the Senate voted overwhelmingly, 98-2 I think was the vote in the Senate, saying that the Russian sanctions should not be lifted. Why? Because Trump wanted to lift them. Since they were going to override his veto, Trump had to sign that into legislation. But has he actually continued to put those sanctions on Russia? Turns out the answer is no. So we go to Mother Jones. The White House has blown by an October 1st deadline for beginning to implement new sanctions targeting Russia, drawing concern in Congress that President Donald Trump is planning to ignore parts of a bill he grudgingly signed in August. Supposed to start on October 1st. Mother Jones wrote about that, I think, on October 11th. Here we are 10 more days later, roughly, and still hasn't imposed the sanctions. Wait a minute, you signed the bill, you're supposed to do it. The Treasury and State Departments also have not issued guidance on their plans for imposing the measure, as Senate aides said. They're not even planning to put the new sanctions in place. And Mother Jones reminds us that Trump opposed the new legislation, agreeing to sign it only after it became clear that Congress could override his veto, but he also issued a presidential signing statement suggesting he might ignore what he said were a number of clearly unconstitutional provisions in the legislation. In other words, I'm not going to do it. I'm going to pretend to do it, but here we are. It was supposed to be on October 1st, and many weeks later, he still hasn't put the sanctions on Russia. He never wanted to put the sanctions on Russia because he's working with Russia. I think that it is entirely possible that the Russians tried to influence both the Clintons and Trump in different ways. And I think that they had some success with the Clintons, unfortunately, under the Obama administration, or at least there's at a minimum the appearance of success on that. And with Trump, it seems like they have had spectacular success. And no matter how much Congress demanded those sanctions and Trump signed it, still nothing. Help us build independent media together. Come join us, tytnetwork.com/join.